Okay, well, I'm here now to talk about the patron saint, the national saint, for the week that's in it. On the subject of St. Patrick, I could be here for a week because there are so many things about him, so many myths and rumours and stories and tales in circulation about St. Patrick. It's very hard to know what was the real Patrick and who is the person we should really be commemorating. Whether he existed, whether there was 2 of them or 3 of them or maybe more. You pay your money, you take your choice. At the end of all of this, you can decide for yourselves what's the most plausible setup for Patrick. I've given the title St. Patrick and his Biographers, Ancient and Modern, because there has been a lot of dispute about St. Patrick in the modern period. There are still books and articles appearing on the subject. If you go on to the RTE brainstorm, is that what they call it? I think they have a brainstorm sort of web type thing. You'll get an article on St. Patrick and you'll get all kinds of things in the run-up to the great day. I used to tell my students when I was giving a course on Patrick that almost everything that they've ever heard or read about St. Patrick is wrong. I'll tell you 1 or 2 things that might be right. They might be right. I can't say they're absolutely, definitely, definitively right, but they may be correct about St. Patrick, or about the history of Patrick, or whatever. But generally speaking, most of what you have heard about St. Patrick, most of what you'll read in the parish newsletter or in the newspaper is complete bunkum, okay? Complete garbage. Now you may well wonder, how has it come to that point? How could it possibly be that for somebody as famous as St. Patrick we know nothing? I should rephrase it. We actually know a lot about St. Patrick, but a lot of what you're told about St. Patrick is mistaken for all kinds of reasons, and maybe by the time I'm finished you'll have some idea why that is the case. So maybe during question time you can ask me why this, that or the other point of information about Patrick is not what it claims to be. There are all kinds of things you could ask about St. Patrick, obviously. When did Patrick come to Ireland? When did Patrick come to Ireland? Your starter question for 5. When did Patrick come to Ireland? 432. Yeah, everybody's agreed. 432. It's amazing. Almost certainly wrong. Complete bunkum, nonsense, complete garbage. I'll explain how we ended up with the year 432, but it's almost certainly wrong. Okay, and we're wrong at the beginning, and we'll be wrong at the end. When did Patrick die, by the way? You're very good now. It's a good start. You know when he arrived. So when did he die? 461. Any other offers? Actually, he died on Wednesday, according to one of our authorities, but I'll come back to that. Patrick died in 461. He had died previous to that in 457, and he died after that in 493. So by 493 he was seriously dead, really dead, unlikely to come back at that stage, okay? And again you might wonder, how is it that Patrick could have died 3 times? It's nonsense, obviously, but which date? Which is the one we have to choose? Which is the correct date? That's part of the fun. Okay, so when did Patrick come to Ireland? 432 is the so-called official date. So that in 1932, for example, the great Eucharistic year, there was great panoply, great hula and so on about Patrick. All because everybody, not everybody, but they did, I suppose, everybody believed that the great man had arrived in 432. Why did he come to Ireland? To bring Christianity? Okay, yeah, but that's only one particular answer to the question, if you like. Who sent him? Now, he would have said himself that God sent him, okay, not much arguing with that. But there are also people involved who would have sent Patrick, or at least there are people who were involved with St. Patrick after he had arrived. People who were higher than him, who would have represented, in his case, the British Church, because it's worth bearing in mind, although we think of St. Patrick as the patron saint of Ireland, he wasn't an Irishman. He was a Brit. Okay? Paddy the Brit. Okay? Who sent him? Okay, we'll come back to that maybe later on. Where in Ireland did he work? Okay, you've all heard of Pope Patrick and all this kind of thing, Slemish and so on. I'll show you a map in a moment that somebody put together, supposedly depicting Patrick's travels during the years when he was active in Ireland. Okay, but I'll come back to that in a moment. When did he die? Okay, we know he died 3 times. Where is he buried? Yeah, that's interesting. I would have expected most people to say Armagh, since he is touted as the founder of Armagh, head of the church in Armagh, but actually Downpatrick is one of those facts which we think might actually be true. Okay, a case can be made for Downpatrick for reasons I'll come to maybe before I finish. Was he the first to bring Christianity to Ireland? Is Patrick the missionary saint who converted the Irish? Okay, well, no, actually, on this point we are rather well informed. In fact, better informed than we are about most of the other things to do with Patrick, even though this has nothing to do with Patrick. There's a bit of a conundrum there, and I'll come back to it in a moment. We actually have a source called a chronicle, compiled by a man called Prosper of Aquitaine in the south of France. And in the year 429, 431, and 435, different text in 435, he had interesting things to say about Ireland and the introduction of Christianity to Ireland. In 429, he says, Agricola the Pelagian, son of the Pelagian bishop. Now you don't have to fall flat on the floor at the mention of a bishop having a son. Okay, we're sophisticated people now, we're used to this kind of thing at this stage. Okay, so this Agricola the Pelagian, who was the son of a bishop, in this case also a Pelagian. What a Pelagian was, I'll explain in a moment. Corrupts the churches of Britain with the insinuation of his dogma. Pelagius was the last of the great heresiarchs or heretics in the late antique church. He was a staunch opponent of St. Augustine and St. Jerome and some of the other early church fathers. Pelagius used to be believed, it used to be believed that Pelagius was Irish, which I would like to think is true, but almost certainly is not. I'd like to think it's true because Pelagius had very interesting ideas. He fought very doggedly and hard and long against St. Augustine on the whole question of original sin, for example, and predestination and the merits of grace and all that kind of thing. There was heated discussion in the church in Western Europe throughout the latter decades of the 4th century and into the 5th century, and Pelagius was at the very forefront of that and very, very strongly opposed by Augustine, and indeed by Prosper. Prosper was a follower of Augustine's and a very staunch follower of his. So when somebody is called a Pelagian, he's basically being called a heretic. Okay, it's as simple as that. So in this case, there was a Pelagian heresy, and this man Agricola espoused it. He was a proponent of that heresy, as indeed his father had been before him, the bishop, Severianus. And this Agricola in 429 is described by Prosper as corrupting the church. Now, I've given you the Latin there in brackets because it's in the present tense. He's not reporting recorded action. He's talking about the here and now. In 429, this man is corrupting the church. Okay? The churches of Britain, with the insinuation of his dogma, the dogma being these various Pelagian heresies. But at the instigation of the deacon Palladius, Pope Celestine, no less, the Pope, sends, again, it's the present tense, minted, Pope Celestine sends Germanus, Bishop of Auxerre, on his behalf, and having overturned the heretics, restores the Britons to the Catholic faith. So in around the 420s, the church in Britain was in trouble. It was beginning to espouse this Pelagian heresy. This was anathema to Rome. Rome decided this was a very serious matter, and they sent our friend Germanus to deal with it. Germanus was the single most important person in the Gallican church at this time. So he goes to Britain, he counters the Pelagians, and he restores the British church back to the Catholic faith. In 431, 2 years later, okay, to the Irish believing in Christ, Palladius is ordained. Again, it's the present tense. He's not talking about the past tense, something that happened long ago. This is Prosper talking about events to which he himself is a witness. He's a contemporary witness. In 431, he says, to the Irish believing in Christ, Palladius is ordained bishop by Pope Celestine. This is the same Palladius as we had before. Or rather, no, this is Palladius for the first time, but it's the same Celestine as we had before, Pope Celestine. In 431, ordained a man called Palladius to be the first bishop, primus episcopus of the Irish. Primus episcopus. Seems to mean first bishop. The Latin is straightforward enough. It's hard to see what else it could mean. Primus is first, episcopus is bishop. So this man Palladius is ordained by no less a person than the Pope in 431 as Bishop of the Irish. Okay. Now Palladius is Palladius. He is not Patricius. He is not Patrick. He is Palladius. Okay. Now you might think there's a mistake or there's some kind of confusion, but no. When you go on to roughly speaking, 433, 4 or 5, we're not absolutely sure. But in the same period, the same author, Prosper, who is very well informed, as I say, reports that with no less care did he, Celestine, free the British provinces from the same disease when he repelled certain enemies of grace. In other words, he's reporting what happened in 429. And by ordaining a bishop to the Irish, while he strove to keep the Roman island Catholic, he made the barbarous island Christian. We are the barbarous island. Now, it's not an insult. It's not intended as a denigration of the Irish. It's pure and simple. We are an insula barbara because we're not part of the Roman Empire. Simple as that. If you're in the Roman Empire, you're Roman. Everybody else is a barbarian. Doesn't care who they are, where they are, how sophisticated they may be. It doesn't matter. It's them and us. We are Romans. We are civilized. They are barbarians. Okay. So in this case, it's the barbarian Irish because we are outside of the Roman Empire. Okay. We're on the farthest periphery of the Roman Empire. The important thing to remember is Celestine is the same Celestine as we had before, and Palladius is the same Palladius as we had before, and the Christianization of Ireland has taken place at the instigation of the Pope. Okay? Remember that. These are facts that crop up in the later history of Patrick. Now, those are the names mentioned by Prosper. Agricola, who is the Pelagian, Severianus, his father, who is a Pelagian, Germanus, Bishop of Auxerre, Palladius appears first in 429 as a deacon, and then appears in 431 as bishop. Celestine is the same Celestine. Pelagius is the same heretic. As I say, it used to be thought that Pelagius was Irish on the simple basis that St. Jerome insulted everybody. St. Jerome made a point of insulting everybody. He was obnoxious. But in this case, he accused our friend Pelagius of being Scotus pultipus pregravatus, which translates as stuffed with Irish porridge. The impression you get from Augustine and Jerome and other contemporaries is that Pelagius was big. He was large in both directions. He was a tall man and he was a big man. He was a very impressive individual for all kinds of reasons. But stuffed with Irish porridge literally is the reason why some people in the last century or the 19th century believed that Pelagius might have been an Irishman. Most people believe he was a Briton, and most people toy with the idea that he might have belonged to the Irish population. There was an Irish population in Britain in the late antique period, the 3rd, 4th and 5th centuries and so on, but that's a different story. Romana Insula, we've met before. The Romana Insula, the Roman island, is Britain, because Britain was part of the Roman Empire. The Barbara Insula, on the other hand, is us, as I say, and we are the barbarous people because we are not Roman. Now, none of those names that I gave you a moment ago occurs in any of Patrick's writings. Okay, none of them. No Pope, no Germanus, no Agricola, no Severianus, no Pelagius, none of them. None of those names occur anywhere in the text that we regard as original, authentic, patrician writings, the writings of St. Patrick. What are those writings of St. Patrick? Well, there are two texts that you might have heard of, generally referred to either as two letters or as the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus and the Confessio. The Confessio is a sort of letter. It's a confession, okay, it's not quite the confession that we're used to, say, in the Roman Catholic tradition. It's a sort of public statement of self-justification. Anybody who's been accused of something would make a confessio, not confessing that they're guilty, but proclaiming their innocence. And it's the public nature of it that makes it a confessio. So there are two writings of Patrick's that have come down to us. That is absolutely miraculous. The fact that there are two writings still in existence that were apparently written by the man that we know and love as Patrick, that they have survived is nothing short of miraculous. I mean, it is really extraordinary. I have no explanation for why they survived. I have no explanation for why only those two texts survived. I mean, Patrick, if you read these two documents, you can see quite clearly he was a regular letter writer. He must have been writing back to his companions in Britain. He must have been writing to his fellow Christians in Ireland and so on, but none of those other documents has survived. We wish they had. We'd love if they did, and if anybody ever finds them, their names will go down in history. But for the moment, we are stuck is not the word. We have to make do with the confession and the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. That's the opening part of Patrick's Confessio. okay? In the oldest copy that survives, the oldest copy of Patrick's Confessio that we have is in a manuscript or a book called the Book of Armagh. And the Book of Armagh is what it says on the tin. It's a book written in Armagh. It's a famous text. I'll come back to it in a minute because I have another slide of it. This is what it looks like. Now remember, Patrick was in Ireland maybe in the early 400s, maybe in the later 400s. One of the problems we have with St. Patrick is the chronology of St. Patrick. If you believe, I don't, but if you believe that Patrick arrived in 432, then you construct Patrick's career in Ireland from that point on, okay? There are arguments for saying that Patrick was here later. Most modern historians, I would say nowadays, tend to put Patrick in the latter part, the second half of the 5th century. But there are arguments either way. There's an argument even for saying that Patrick arrived before 432, and I'll come to that in a moment, okay? But you have to remember the Book of Armagh, I'll give you details of it in a moment, was written anywhere between 300 and 400 years after Patrick, no matter where you put Patrick in the 5th century. The Book of Armagh was written somewhere between 800 and the mid-9th century, 848 I think it is. So that there's roughly speaking 300 or 400 years of it. That's a long time, okay, for a text to survive. It's miraculous that a text could have survived 400 years without any record of it until we get to the Book of Armagh, but that's where we are. Luckily, it has survived. There are interesting things about the Book of Armagh. There are interesting things about Patrick's confession in the Book of Armagh. And one of the really interesting things about the Book of Armagh is that it doesn't have the text of Patrick's letters to the soldiers of Caroticus. It only has the confession, okay? Why that's the case, I'll come back to if I think of it later on. This is what it looks like. That is what Irish handwriting looks like in the period around about 800. The Book of Armagh is my favourite Irish book. Lots of people love the Book of Kells, obviously, for all kinds of reasons, but in terms of sheer penmanship, the beauty of the handwriting, the Book of Armagh, that doesn't do it justice because it's slightly out of focus, but that's what it looks like. Ego Patricius, peccato rusticissimus, I, Patrick, a sinner, the most removed, rusticissimos, and least of all men, least of all the faithful. It's a remarkable opening statement. What does Patrick say? Ego Patricius. Okay, we have his name. Patrick, it seems to be his name anyway. Gives his father's name as Calpurnius and says he was a deacon of the Christian Church, the Catholic Church. Says his grandfather was actually a priest. Again, we shouldn't be too shocked. Clerical celibacy only comes into the church as a regular practice around about the 11th century. It wouldn't have existed in our period, okay? I'm sorry, ladies, Patrick doesn't tell us Mammy's name. Okay? You could put it down to misogyny. It's more than likely that in those days it just wasn't done. The name given was the father's name. Generally speaking, the mother's name didn't figure. There is a tradition, and it's preserved in the Book of Armagh, that her name was Concessa. Could have been. Somebody in the Irish tradition, somebody in Armagh, or somebody else might have heard that Patrick's mother's name was Concessa and remembered it and preserved it. It's possible, but there's just no proof for it. Certainly Patrick doesn't say so. Where was he born? He gives his birthplace, Banavan Tabernia. We've no idea where it is. Which is a pity. No idea where it is. Somewhere in Britain, but we've no idea where. He says he was taken captive when he was in his 16th year. He came over to Ireland. He was taken prisoner and brought over as a slave, and he was here for 6 years, tending animals and so on. And where was he captive? Again, there's uncertainty. Slemish is mentioned in some of the tradition. Croagh Patrick is mentioned in other traditions. Nearby the Western Sea is what he himself says. But what is the Western Sea? Is it Western from a British point of view? In which case it's George's Channel or something like that. Or is it Western by our standards? Is he talking about the Atlantic? We don't know. He doesn't say. He gives the name, but again, we don't know what the name means. The Book of Armagh. Okay, all of this is in the Book of Armagh, as I say, in the Confessio. And the scribe, we know, Fair Dovnach, died in 846, and we know because there's a note in the book which says that he wrote the book at the behest of the then abbot, a man called Turbo. And since he died in 808, we have, roughly speaking, that first half century to play around with as the dates for the Book of Armagh. And the Book of Armagh has what we call the Patrick dossier, the patrician dossier. All the texts that are ever used by any historians ever to reconstruct the life of St. Patrick, all those texts, almost without exception, are in the Book of Armagh. Mirachu, the most famous biographer, the Vita Patrici, the life of St. Patrick, probably around the 680s or 690s or something like that. The text itself, although it has survived in multiple copies, there's no date. But we can work out by various means that it's probably late 7th century. Tíreachán, who was actually a Mayo man, came from around Killala, composed a collectanium, which is basically a list of all the places that are supposedly associated with St. Patrick. A sort of gazetteer, as it were, of all the various places in Ireland which either were or claimed to be associated with St. Patrick. There's a book called Liber Angeli, strange book, very strange book. Liber Angeli means simply the book of the angel, because it supposedly records an encounter that Patrick had with an angel, in which the angel bestowed all these various rights and prerogatives on Patrick as leader of the Irish Church. It's a very dodgy text. It's a propaganda text that's almost certainly cooked up by the Church of Armagh to bolster their claims to be the site of Patrick's burial and therefore the seat of the Irish Church from the 7th century on. It's a strange book, but interesting at the same time. The Book of Armagh was described by the great James Kenny, Canadian-Irish historian, who produced a book that is still, for all the fact that it appeared in 1929, it's still the Bible for people like myself who study early Irish history, or at least the early history of the Church in Ireland. Sources for the early history of Ireland is a magnificent book, really one of the wonders of the Irish historical tradition, a really magnificent piece of historical scholarship. And Kenny describes the Book of Armagh as the most important historical manuscript of Ireland prior to the 12th century. And it's interesting for all kinds of reasons, and this is one of them. Obviously, this is the so-called patrician section that I mentioned to you before. You saw the top of it there a moment ago, Ego Patricius, Peccato, Rusticissimos, and so on. That's the opening part of it. And this is only part of the Book of Armagh, which is interesting in itself. The Book of Armagh was actually revered throughout the Middle Ages because it was believed to be Patrick's own Bible. It was called Crónín Fádric, Patrick's own Bible. The reason being that apart from the patrician texts, Mirachu, Tíreachán, the Liber Angeli, and the various other bits and pieces that you find in the Book of Armagh, it also contains the entire New Testament. In fact, it's the only surviving early Irish manuscript that contains the entire New Testament. So I'm talking 4 Gospels, the letters of St. Paul, the Catholic epistles, the Apocalypse, everything that goes to make up the New Testament. So even if you have no interest in St. Patrick, and there are people out there who have none, even if you have no interest in Ireland, this manuscript is of extraordinary importance for anybody who's interested in the history of the Bible, or the transmission of the Bible as a text, because the Book of Armagh is the only surviving copy we have, complete copy of the New Testament as it was used in the early Irish Church. So if you want to know what the Irish were reading in the Irish Church in the period up to and before 800, then the Book of Armagh is our only authentic source of information on their New Testament. Okay, it's a very, very important text. The manuscript also has the life of St. Martin, interestingly enough, Martin of Tours. What else does it have? It has various other texts as well. It's actually, although small in size, it's a compact little book. It's actually quite a thick book and a very interesting book for all kinds of reasons. Has any of you ever been to see the Book of Kells in Trinity? Well, depending on when you were there, if you were there, say, 10 years ago or there or thereabouts, then you almost certainly saw the Book of Armagh. Because in the old days, in the old exhibition, before they revamped it now and reopened it, anytime you went in to look at the Book of Kells, beside it they always had another manuscript called the Book of Durrow, a decorated gospel book, and then on the other side again, the Book of Armagh. You would have seen the Book of Armagh, whether you realised it or not. As you can see, it's a beautiful piece of handwriting. It's an absolutely magnificent feat of penmanship. But from our point of view, it is the beginning and the end. It is the most important source of information about St. Patrick. Now, the strange thing is that although that manuscript that I showed you a moment ago, and most of the other manuscripts, in fact, of St. Patrick's writings that have come down for us from the medieval period, there's quite a few of them, though none of them as old as Patrick himself, you have to wait until 1656 until there's access to a printed version of Patrick's writings. It's only in 1656, the mid-17th century, that you get the first printed text of Patrick's writings. So that if you wanted to know what Patrick said, there's no going back beyond that date. Okay, the traditions, and yet at that stage, by that time, you could say that the traditions, the myths, the story, the legends, if you like, of St. Patrick have already been formed. And it's only in the 17th century that we're in a position to go back and check all those legends against what the great man said himself. And that brings you to the modern biographers. Okay, I was talking about the medieval biographers. Murchu and Tíreachán are the principal sources of the so-called biographical information about St. Patrick after you've parted company, let's say, with Patrick's own writings. Now, when I say that, I put it that way deliberately because, generally speaking, almost everything that you read about on the subject of St. Patrick is based on the legendary material. It's based on Murchu and Tíreachán and the later material. Okay, that's not to say that modern writers, or indeed medieval writers, were not familiar with Patrick's writings. In fact, it's interesting. Murchu, for example, wrote his life of St. Patrick at the request of the Church of Armagh. It's what we would call an official biography, okay? So he had access to all the sources that you would expect an official biographer to have. So he must have had access, and you can prove that he had access because he quotes. He must have had access to Patrick's confession. There must have been a copy of Patrick's confession in Armagh when Murchu was writing round about the end of the 7th century, okay? The trouble is, Murchu doesn't give a hoot about the real St. Patrick. In fact, Murchu's life of Patrick is a travesty, it's a joke. It's a disgrace, really, as a biography, as an attempt to represent the man himself. It's a fraud. It really is a shocking piece of work. It's a magnificent book in all kinds of other reasons, in the way he tells his story, the story he tells, and what he has to tell us about Ireland in his time. But as somebody who's supposedly talking to us about his hero figure, his subject person, Patrick himself, he tells us absolutely nothing that we wouldn't know already from Patrick's own writings. And in fact, the shocking thing about Murchu is the way in which he distorts what Patrick says about himself in the Confessio particularly. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Murchu deliberately lies about Patrick, but he certainly twists the evidence for his own particular purpose. And he tells all kinds of stories about St. Patrick that he cannot have got in the Confessio because they're not there, and that he cannot have got in any other source as well, okay? Not in the 7th century, not in Armagh. The Patrick that you get in Murchu is a sort of Clint Eastwood Patrick, okay? This guy is a gunslinging missionary saint. He strides around Ireland looking for pagans, okay? And in every saloon there's always 2 or more pagans hanging out at the bar. And they foolishly come out into the street and they stand up in front of Patrick and they challenge him to a duel. And then they're dust, okay? Their history, they're just blast. You can imagine Patrick with that sort of cigarette butt and the hat and the cloak that Clint wears in those wonderful movies, just moving slightly and twitching an eyebrow, and then all of a sudden, the Druids are gone, okay? Paganism is blasted out of it, okay? There are no miracle stories in Patrick's own writings, by the way. He's not interested in miracles. He wasn't performing miracles. The age of miracles was over by his time. And he certainly has no stories about it. But at the same time, I don't want to give the wrong impression, because Murchu is a magnificent storyteller. I mean, the stories that Murchu does have about St. Patrick are rip-roaring stories. They're great stuff, in the same way that Clint Eastwood movies are great stuff, okay? You don't believe a word of them, but they're so good and they're so well told that really the whole thing is a tour de force. It's a travesty as a history, as a piece of literary creation, fantastic. Tíreachán is slightly different, because Tíreachán is, basically speaking, making claims on behalf of Armagh, principally on the basis that he has gone around the country, or at least he has got information from all around the country, relating to those places where Patrick supposedly passed through, okay? We'll see now in a second what I mean. But I'll put this one up first, because this is the modern Okay, this is the alternative history of Patrick, if you like. When you part company with the medieval Patrick and you come to the modern, it's curious that the first serious scholarly modern account of St. Patrick that we would look on as worth reading, let's say, as a serious piece of scholarship, is this book produced in 1864, St. Patrick, Apostle of Ireland, a memoir of his life and mission, by a man called James Henthorne Todd, James J.H. Todd, who is an ecclesiastical scholar in Trinity College, Dublin, and was also Trinity's librarian. He acquired a very good knowledge of Irish, did excellent work in the 19th century, producing good editions for the time of texts that are important for the history of the Irish Church in the medieval period. A fine scholar. Although it was said of Todd, it was complained about Todd later on by more recent biographers, that his is the Protestant Patrick, okay? And this is part of our problem. There is a sort of Protestant St. Patrick and a Catholic St. Patrick, okay? And depending on which denomination you belong to, you might be inclined to go for one particular version of the Patrick story or the other, okay? It's unfair, I think, to accuse Henthorne Todd of being a Protestant historian. I don't think that's good. I don't think it's accurate. He was better than that. It's not fair, but I don't have time to go into the nitty-gritty of it. Someone else who crops up in the modern period, again amongst the pioneers of patrician scholarship, is this German, Heinrich Zimmer, a remarkable individual. Some of you may well be aware that in terms of the history of Celtic studies, as we call it nowadays, the study of Irish and the Irish language and early Irish literature and so on, the charge was led, if you like, the foundations were laid in the 19th century, from the mid-19th century on, by a succession of German scholars, not by Irish scholars. There were great Irish scholars in the last century, in the 19th century, people like John O'Donovan or Eugene O'Curry and so on. But they were of a different kind of scholarship. The Germans had developed a more scientific and scientifically grounded study of language and literature and so on. And Heinrich Zimmer was one of the pioneers of that kind of scholarship. He was also a pioneer scholar in a whole variety of other ways. An interesting character, fascinating character. He was the man, for example, who rescued Pelagius's writings. The same Pelagius that I mentioned before, the man who authored the heresy, if you remember, Agricola Pelagianus, and his father Severianus, the Pelagian. But that heresy was sort of revived, or at least the knowledge of it was revived in the 19th century, mainly due to the researches of Zimmer, who found the earliest manuscripts of Pelagius and published his writings, and revealed for the first time what it was that people meant by Pelagianism, what was the actual content of the heresy. Now, the reason I have him here is that he wrote all kinds of things, including a brief history of the early Irish Church, which he did for a German ecclesiastical encyclopedia, Real Encyclopédie de Kirche, I suppose it was called, in 1890 or 1895. He produced a history of the early Irish Church in which he argued that Patrick was a complete figment of the imagination, and that he had been cooked up by the Church of Armagh as part of a propaganda campaign to establish themselves as the leading church in Ireland. Okay? Now, you might think this would cause a rumpus. The only problem was it was in Germany. Okay, so not many people here now subscribe to the Real Encyclopedia of German Ecclesiastical History. And it was only when Zimmer's views were translated into English at the beginning of the 20th century that the whole story hotted up. And in fact, there's a wonderful story about the translation when it appeared. I think it was in the early 1900s, if not 1910. And the story goes that there was a student, postgraduate student at Zimmer's, working on the Aran Islands, doing a study of the Irish of Aran. And in fact, there is a book, Die Araner Mundart, by a guy called Fink, which was produced at exactly around that time. He may be the person concerned. But the story was that when the newspapers got hold of this heretical view of Zimmer, the idea that Patrick didn't exist and that he'd been cooked up by the Church of Armagh for their own purposes, that this obviously caused an uproar, and the police at the time, who would have been the RIC, I suppose, went out to the Aran Islands and informed our friend Fink that he'd better get the hell off the island, because if the natives discovered what his doctor father, what his mentor had just published on the subject of the national saint, the chances were he'd be taken out to Donaghpatrick and wrecked into the Atlantic. Okay? So our friend Fink anyway went off home and wrote his book on the Irish of Ireland, a very good book actually, and Simmer went on to great things. And it was known that Simmer had published a study. No, he hadn't published. The point was he had put together a full-length, at least he said himself, that he had put together a full-length study of St. Patrick based on all the evidence, and nobody ever found it. And one of the reasons was that in 1905 or 1910, I forget, I think it was 1910 actually, poor Simmer's house went up in flames in Berlin. He was professor of Celtic philology in Berlin at the time. His house went up in flames and his library went up with it. And we all assumed, everybody assumed that was the end of that. Until a student of mine, Emma Varntus, who was a graduate student of mine, PhD of mine recently, now gainfully employed by Trinity College Dublin in their Department of History. During his researches in Berlin, he found a 575-page text of Zimmer's Life of St. Patrick. The life that everybody believed had gone up in flames in 1910 has been there all along. And in fact, they're working at the moment on the process of conserving the manuscript and then printing it and then translating it. So there may be more ructions about St. Patrick in 5 or 10 years. If you have €20,000, by the way, that you'd like to contribute to the cause, I'll have a chat with you afterwards. In the meantime, we just have to await this with great hope. Yes, I mentioned Tirchon's Clectania. This was a book that appeared in, I think it's 1879, the date is obscured there by the stamp. Loca Patriciana, patrician places, patrician locations, okay? And it is supposedly a complete gazetteer of all the places, as I say, that were associated with Patrick in the various lives. And he talks in addition about 3 Patricks, you'll see. Not just 2 Patricks, but 3 Patricks. But you can see there from the map, this was by a man called John Shearman, J.F. Shearman. You can see that if any of this is true, then Patrick must have died of exhaustion. If he really did get around to all those places, then it's quite clear that that's what did for him. Okay? Closer to home, again, around the same time, 1905, in this case, we have another big biography of Patrick by John Healy, Bishop of Tuam. The Life and Writings of St. Patrick, I think it's 700 pages long. Don't bother. It's full of all kinds of things, but not the least is he says at one stage that Patrick died on Wednesday, Wednesday, the 17th of March in the year 493 at the age of 120. And he says, of all the things to do with St. Patrick's life, that is the single most reliable fact. Okay? Yeah, 17 March. Now, that is not where we get 17 March, by the way. It's part of the tradition, but it's not where it originates. 17 March, I'll come back to before I finish. It's a big book full of all kinds of things. You know, it's typical of its time, it's typical of its author, and so on. It's mostly garbage. Okay? The Royal Irish Academy, about 20 years ago, maybe more, announced a project to collect together all the published references to St. Patrick, all the articles, all the books, all the pamphlets, everything on the subject of St. Patrick. I address this now to my librarian friends. They gave it up. They decided it just wasn't worth it. There's so much published out there on St. Patrick, and so much of it is junk that really should be pulped or burned. Unfortunately, you do severe damage to the environment if you burn all the worthless stuff on St. Patrick, and you'll be left with not a lot afterwards. But this is one of those that could probably be consigned to the heap. Okay? Not so this book, which interestingly enough appeared in the same year, 1905. J.B. Bury, arguably the most famous, arguably the best historian this country ever produced. Now I say that obviously in deference to Dermot Peritia and all these wonderful people up in Dublin. But J.B. Bury was a famous historian in his time. He eventually ended up as Regius Professor of History in Cambridge. Being Regius Professor of History in Cambridge is second only to sitting beside God. Okay, as far as the English system is concerned, Regius Professor is it. Okay, and he was Regius Professor of History in Cambridge. Died in 1927 and is buried in Rome. Before that, he had been a student and then a professor, a double professor in Trinity College, actually. He was Professor of History and Professor of Greek at the same time. He was a bit precocious. There's a wonderful story told about him in relation to a man called Richard Tyrrell. Trinity had various professors in the 19th century, some of them more highly regarded than others, let's say. Tyrrell was regarded by the Germans as one of the best. He was on a level with them, so they had a fine regard for him. He was professor of Greek. And there was a tradition in those days, I think there might still be a tradition, but I'm not altogether sure, that the leading professors at Trinity College used to go around visiting all the Church of Ireland schools in the country, looking for likely lads that they could bring down and to give scholarships to and train them up as future leaders of the Church of Ireland. And they used to do the tour, as I say, and they ended up in Foyle College. And there's this story about Tyrrell having interviewed young Master Bury and interrogated him on the finer points of Greek grammar, and he could fault him on nothing. He could not trip up Bury on the subject of any grammatical point in Greek grammar. And Bury was 10 at the time. Yeah, disgusting. The picture doesn't do him justice. Apparently he had flowing, wavy red hair. There is a portrait of him, I think, in colour, but I haven't managed to locate it. But he was a wonderful, wonderful scholar. He was very good, actually. Bury is well worth reading, and his Life of St. Patrick and his place in history is one of the monuments of Irish scholarship in the modern period. Bury, interestingly enough, although he was the son of a Church of Ireland minister himself, he was born and reared in Clontibret, in County Monaghan. We all know Clontibret because that's where Mr. Robinson and the DUP came over the border and occupied the town, I think, for a day in protest against what we were doing back in those days, to upset our friends across the border. Clontibret is not the centre of the universe, but Bury was home taught by his father to the point where, as I say, he could duel with Tyrrell. He eventually ended up in Trinity College. It used to be said of him that he was a man who knew the language of every country in Europe except his own. He didn't have any Irish, but he had Hungarian, Russian, German, Greek, and everything else, but he didn't have any Irish. Now, you might regard that as a disadvantage, but in fact it's not for the subjects that we're concerned with. The study of Patrick and the story of Patrick and the origin of Christianity and so on doesn't really require a very thorough knowledge of Irish. It would be a help if you had it, but it's not absolutely essential. Knowledge of Latin is much more important, obviously, and Bury certainly was good from that point of view. Strange enough, although he was, as I say, the son of a Church of Ireland minister, he was himself a staunch agnostic, a staunch atheist. He had no time for this kind of stuff. And interestingly, too, the Life of St. Patrick has that subtitle, His Place in History. Sounds rather grand or grandiose or whatever, but Bury meant it, because one of the things that's worth bearing in mind about Bury is, or rather about Patrick, is that he is the only person in history from the Roman world who was taken captive, taken out of the Roman Empire, kept in captivity, who escaped from that captivity and came back home and wrote his story. There's nothing like it. There's absolutely nothing like it anywhere else in the history of Western literature, okay? It is an absolutely unique document. So it's of importance to us because of who we are, because of Patrick. It's important to Roman historians because of what it is and what it has to say about the Roman world and Patrick's experience of that world and so on. It's a very, very important text, and that's why Bury entitled his book The Life of St. Patrick and His Place in History. Patrick is a very, very important person in history, if you believe in that kind of thing, okay? Now, it's probably fair to say that from our point of view, from an Irish point of view, the life and legend of St. Patrick, or the story of St. Patrick, is more or less what you have in Mirachu and the other 7th century texts as transmitted down to the modern period, with certain alterations from time to time, depending on who came on the scene, whether you're reading Healy or whether you're reading Todd or any of the other books that appeared, and you're only getting a selection here, I have to warn you. And there was a sort of standard St. Patrick, as it were, which seemed to contain more or less all the silly things about St. Patrick. Historians who are inclined towards denominational history, if you like, Protestant versus Catholic historians, people would say that the Patrick who came down, the Patrick of legend, is more of a Catholic Patrick than a Protestant Patrick, for all kinds of reasons, okay? And things rested so. There is a version of Patrick that was in circulation that was widely respected and widely known, and had been that way more or less from the time of Bury, and before that from the time of Todd, down to the mid or early 1940s, and then things changed dramatically. In 1942, on the 20th of March 1942, a man called T.F. O'Rahilly gave a famous lecture. T.F. O'Rahilly is famous in Celtic studies, is one of the best scholars of Irish we ever had, a really, really, really wonderful scholar of Irish and the Irish language and Irish literature in all its faces. He was a super scholar. He was brother of Alfred O'Rahilly, the lunatic who was University of Cork, UCC president, complete barmy, absolutely barmy. He also had a sister, Cecily O'Rahilly, who was a very fine scholar. If you ever come to read about Táin Bó Cúailinge, if you want a modern, reliable, authentic, good, scholarly version of the Táin Bó Cúailinge, the Cuchulainn story, then you will be reading Cecily O'Rahilly. She was the modern authority on the subject. They were fine scholars, all of them, particularly T.F. and his sister. But in 1942, O'Rahilly gave a talk, which was the annual statutory lecture at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, School of Celtic Studies. Liam mentioned to me earlier, and I should have put it in actually. I hadn't thought of it, I should have thought of it. But I'll come back to it in a moment. Don't let me go on without coming back to it. Okay? O'Rahilly gave this talk in 1942 in Trinity, appropriately, the Godless University, as they used to call it, called Palladius and Patrick. And that appeared subsequently in print as the Two Patricks. Okay? The Two Patrick had the effect of an atomic bomb on Ireland, on the plain people of Ireland, and on the scholars who were concerned with the study of St. Patrick. It had the effect of an atomic bomb because it completely destroyed the tradition of St. Patrick. Everything that anybody thought they knew about St. Patrick was gone as a result of O'Rahilly's talk. It is a remarkable piece of historical writing, it must be said. And such was the effect that although the rest of the world was worried about World War II, and Dniepropetrovsk you all know because it's in Ukraine and it's been in the news for the last 3 years, so we all know all about Dniepropetrovsk. And while the Russians were surrounding Dniepropetrovsk and the Germans were in retreat and the world was shuddering, all of Europe was trembling, we were worried about O'Rahilly's views of St. Patrick. Okay? And with bated breath, this is actually the other side of that page. That's the front page. This is the next page of the Irish Press on whatever day it was, September 1943. Dr. MacNeill answers Professor O'Rahilly. What's that phrase of George Hamilton's?
Nation holds.
A nation holds, that's it, yes. The nation was holding its breath until the great MacNeill pronounced on O'Rahilly's earth-shaking atomic bomb. MacNeill, I don't need to talk to you about, you all know who MacNeill was. For somebody like me, MacNeill is not quite God Almighty, but he's up there. He's one of the Trinity, let's say. MacNeill's reputation was as an early Irish historian. People like me would regard him as the founding father of early Irish history in the modern period. Everybody else knows him as the commander-in-chief of the Irish Volunteers and the countermanding order and all that kind of thing. That's a different MacNeill, a different part of MacNeill, if you like. But MacNeill, the historian, was one of the great historians. It's a toss-up between him and Bury, really, as to which was the best historian we produced in the 20th century. And everybody deferred to MacNeill. Anything MacNeill said was gospel, and everybody wanted to know. The nation held its breath until MacNeill gave his verdict on O'Rahilly, and it was pretty much dismissive. He was more or less dismissive of O'Rahilly, unjustly actually, because nowadays most scholars would regard O'Rahilly's version of Patrick as way, way better than anything either MacNeill or any of the traditional historians have produced up to that point. After that, things are up and down, as it were. I threw this in because I just happened to be there. Ludwig Bieler was, Schrödinger, you forgot to talk to me about Schrödinger. Yes. Miles Nagopaline, Flann O'Brien, pronounced on the whole question of the problem of St. Patrick, the two Patricks, mainly as a result of O'Rahilly's famous or infamous publication. And he said, wasn't it a shocking thing that an institute for so-called advanced studies could have two scholars, two well-paid scholars, very well-paid scholars, they are still better paid than the university professors. Wasn't it a shocking thing that two overpaid institute scholars could produce work, one of which proved that there were two Patricks and not one, and the other one, which was Erwin Schrödinger, you've all heard of Schrödinger's cat, but in 1940 De Valera established the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies as a model, as an imitation of the Institute for Advanced Studies that had been founded in Princeton in New Jersey, where Einstein was and all these guys, the guys who produced the bomb in the end. But the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies was a seat of higher learning even than a university. And wasn't it a shocking thing that this institution should have two of these guys, and the money was being wasted producing two Patricks instead of one, and reducing the three persons of the Trinity to nothing, because Schrödinger's ideas about life were utterly atheistic and agnostic and so on. As a result of which, the Irish Times was sued. They were sued by the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, who got an apology and a promise that £100, which was big money in those days, would be paid to an institution of the institute's, a charitable institute of the institute's own choosing, and a promise that Miles Nagopaline would never again talk about the Institute of Advanced Studies. We talk about freedom of speech and Elon Musk and all the rest of it nowadays. They were kind of stiff about these things in the old days. But that was Schrödinger, the famous Schrödinger of the cat. Schrödinger got his Nobel Prize for wave mechanics in 1933. I think he and Paul Dirac together won the Nobel Prize. There was a time, it's no exaggeration, there was a time in the early 40s when the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies School of Theoretical Physics was comparable to Princeton. That if you didn't go to Princeton, you came to Dublin and you studied the same kind of quantum mechanics and the same kind of particle physics that was being studied by the great minds of modern science in America. This book was by another Austrian. Schrödinger was an Austrian, and this is another Austrian scholar. Ludwig Bieler was a famous classicist. Fled Austria, fled Vienna, his native Vienna, in 1938 after the Nazis moved in. He wasn't prepared to hang around for them. And came to Dublin. Eventually he was originally a part-time assistant in the library, in the National Library. And then he was appointed professor of late Latin and paleography. Paleography is the study of medieval manuscripts. He was professor of late Latin and paleography in UCD, and in fact my wife Maura and I studied with him when he was still there in the 1970s. He produced a book called The Life and Legend of St. Patrick, which is utter garbage. Shocking. It's a terrible book. You wonder sometimes, how can it be? I mean, he was a learned scholar, very learned man, very nice man actually, very, very decent individual, but he was no historian, he hadn't a clue. And in fact, O'Rahilly wrote a review of The Life and Legend of St. Patrick, which is, you couldn't do it now, you wouldn't get away with it. It was so toxic, you just could not possibly publish a review of that kind nowadays. It's a terrible book for all kinds of reasons. I don't have time to explain it. Things sort of moved up and down, as it were, and there was a sort of flow and a counterflow in the whole study of St. Patrick and the Patrick tradition and the different Patricks, and whether there was one, two, or three, or more Patricks or none. There is a series that occurs, I think it's still on the go in Radio Ireland, the so-called Thomas Davis Lectures. I think they choose a theme every year, and they have a series of speakers, and I think it's still on the go, or was until relatively recently. This appeared, Ludwig Bieler's book, I think, was in 1947. In 1954, a series of radio broadcasts was published by Radio Ireland called St. Patrick, and the most interesting one in it has all the big names of patrician studies. Bieler's in there. I don't think O'Rahilly's there, but a lot of the other scholars were there as well. But one of the best, and certainly one of the most entertaining contributions is by an Italian man called Mario Esposito. Now, if any of you is interested in classical music in Ireland, might have heard of Michele Esposito. Esposito's father was the piano maestro in the Royal College of Music in Dublin and was a famous character in Dublin. I think he's mentioned in Ulysses, I think he's there in Joyce. He was that famous. This is the only known photo of Mario, his son Mario. Mario was kind of mysterious in the sense that he never had an academic job, he never held down an official academic position that I'm aware of. And yet he produced a string of articles from the early 1900s down to 1965 when he died, all of which are incredibly important contributions to the study of the Latin literature of early Ireland. And in the course of that, he obviously studied Patrick's writings, Patrick's Confessio, Patrick's letter to the soldiers of Coroticus, and so on. And he came up with a very interesting theory, an alternative theory to St. Patrick and the traditional Patrick that was being bandied about until then. And his argument was that you don't have any mention, for example, of Palladius in Patrick's writings, not because Patrick was ungrateful, because he didn't acknowledge the people who went before him, or because he was a so-and-so, or for whatever reason. He says the simple reason that Patrick doesn't mention Palladius is that Patrick preceded Palladius. In other words, that Patrick must have come to Ireland in the 4th century. Not 432, or the second half of the 5th century, but in the latter part of the 4th century. And it's actually a very attractive idea. I still find myself attracted by it. There are reasons why it's problematical and it can't be accepted without further ado, but it's interesting. And Esposito was an interesting character. This, as I say, is the only known photo of him. The two ladies are supposedly Russian spies. It was rumoured at one stage, I think it's true actually, it may have cropped up in one of those books that appear occasionally about the War of Independence and what happened afterwards, particularly the peace talks in Paris in 1819. There was talk that Esposito had offered his services to Collins and the Irish government as a representative of the Irish nation at the peace talks, because he was multilingual. He was Italian born, fluent obviously in Italian and English, but had other languages as well, and would have been very good, I'd imagine, as a representative of the Irish people, and he was very devoted to the Irish nation because he spent all his life here. But I think the story is that Collins was just a little bit suspicious and didn't take up the offer, but it would be nice to think that Esposito had a double life, as it were, not just as a Latin scholar. But his contribution to patrician scholarship is very interesting. Jim Carney, I don't know if any of you has ever come across James Carney. His son was Mr. Justice Paul Carney. He used to be prominent in the courts for several years. Jim Carney was a professor in the Institute of Advanced Studies when I was there. He was very kind to me, actually. A mentor to me, I suppose you could say in many ways. And so for that reason, I'm reluctant to say that this book is garbage as well. It's broken. Because although Jim Carney was a wonderful scholar in terms of literary studies or literature, in all phases of the language, he had a gift for discovery, amongst other things, which is a great thing in a historian or in a scholar of any kind. And he had a real touch, he had a real feeling for Irish literature, but he wasn't a historian. And almost all of the problems of St. Patrick that you have here are of Carney's own making. He did not have a clue how to handle the historical literature, which is a pity, because as I say, he was a lovely man and did great things for the study of Irish literature and so on. Some of you may have come across this individual. I suppose you could say that there was a sort of equilibrium, if you like, about patrician studies in the period after the war, let's say, or after O'Reilly, down into the 1960s. There were differences, obviously, and disagreements, but no great hassle, if you like. But then this article appeared in 1962 from the pen of D.A. Binchy, Daniel Binchy, D.A. Binchy, a remarkable individual for all kinds of reasons, not the least being that he was our plenipotentiary in Germany between the wars. He was the official government representative in Weimar, Germany, for the Irish Free State. Remarkable individual. He also was in the Institute for Advanced Studies when I was there. I had the privilege of meeting him and dining with him. I went down to the club with him on one occasion. He was a remarkable individual. He spoke fluent Irish, English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, and whatever else you want, as well as ancient Greek, ancient Latin, Sanskrit, various languages like that. An extraordinary individual. This book, by the way, the kind of thing I would say is that I think it was a lost opportunity. Dan Vinci was an interesting character about which a lot could be said and can still be said, but not in this particular publication. You can see where I got my title, Patrick and his Biographers, Ancient and Modern, modelled on the great Dan. This was a tremendous publication. This also had the effect of an atomic bomb on patrician studies and on general studies. There was a time in the 50s and 60s when things like this actually had a huge impact in the public sphere. We talk about public intellectuals and so on, but this sort of esoteric academic type stuff tends not to impinge much on the ordinary lives, if you like, of everyday Irish people. But things like this article had a huge effect. People were talking about this everywhere in Ireland when it appeared, and it had a huge effect on patrician studies. Not necessarily because it had anything new to say, it doesn't really, but as a survey of everything that had been done up to that point, it really is a magisterial effort. It's chaotic in some places. It's very long. It's 170 pages. And by coincidence or not, it has 431 footnotes. It's a nice touch. Not 432, but 431. Okay? 431 footnotes. It is a remarkable piece of work, and Dan Vinci was a remarkable man. And I think just as O'Rahilly in 42 exploded, if you like, the whole edifice, if you like, of patrician studies, so also this in 1962 completely destroyed the accepted picture of St. Patrick down to that point. If you ask me, were there any books that I would recommend? I mean, it looks at this stage as though I'm telling you all about books that I'd rather you didn't read. There are books out there that are worth reading. This by Edward Thompson, not to be confused with E.P. Thompson, who's the famous English historian of the English working class, a great Marxist historian. Thompson, funny enough, had a trajectory very similar to Bury's. He also was the son of a Church of Ireland rector, although in this case it's not up north in Clontibret. In Bury's case, in this case, Thompson's father was the Church of Ireland rector down in Waterford. And he eventually ended up as Professor of Classics in Nottingham University, and he produced this book, which is, I would say, far and away the best book on the subject. If you ask me hand on heart, which is the one book I would say, this is the one you need to read, then this is the book I would recommend. It's not perfect from start to finish, but if you can get your hands on it, and it does show up every so often, second-hand or whatever, and it has been reprinted, so it should be available. It is very, very good. It's the best example of somebody sticking to the text. Forget everything else. Read your Patrick, read only your Patrick, read nothing but Patrick, don't allow anything to get in the way, and see what happens. And from that point of view, it is a wonderfully forensic and meticulous study of Patrick's writings, which is interesting because I said before that there's a curiosity, there's lots of curiosities about the Book of Armagh, and there are two in particular. One is that the text of the Confessio, although it's the oldest copy of the Confessio that we have, around about, let's say 800, just to have a round date, it's not the whole truth and nothing but the truth. The text of the Confessio in the Book of Armagh has been tampered with. How do we know that? Because we have other copies. There happen to be copies which survive on the continent, and which luckily were based on an original text of Patrick's Confession, which left the country before it was tampered with. Now, when I say it was tampered with, what I mean is that there is a clue in the fact that the Book of Armagh doesn't have the text of Patrick's letter. It's not there at all. Not only is it not tampered with, it's not there at all. There's only the confession in the Book of Armagh. even though the Book of Armagh is the official repository of all things patrician, all things to do with Armagh, and supposedly the foundation for the idea that Patrick established Armagh, and therefore Armagh is the seat of the Irish Church, is the head of the Irish Church, which it still believes itself to be down to the present day. There's no evidence to support it, by the way, but that's a different story. Why is there no text of the letter? Because the letter, if you read it, the letter was written by St. Patrick in the immediate aftermath of a vicious attack on his flock, on a group of newly baptized Christians that he had just presided over, some of whom were simply massacred, they were simply put to the sword, and others were taken away by the soldiers of Coroticus into captivity. And Patrick is absolutely incandescent, as you can imagine. But if you have been brought up on St. Patrick a la Clint Eastwood, you may ask yourself, well, why didn't Patrick do something about this? You know, why didn't he blast the soldiers of Coroticus out of existence with, one twitch of his eyelash? It doesn't happen. The whole thing is pathetic from that point of view. It reveals Patrick at his weakest. There's nothing he can do about this attack. He can call them names. He can call the soldiers names. He can condemn them. He can say they go to hellfire and damnation. But there's nothing he can do about it. And they can only give him the two fingers. And obviously they did. Because in fact the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus, Patrick tells us, is actually the second letter. There was a previous letter sent to the soldiers asking that they make good the damage they had caused, and they obviously told him what to do with himself. So he writes the second letter as a response to that. But it's pathetic for anybody who's used to the gunslinging Patrick, the all-conquering Patrick, the Patrick of legend who smites all opponents and blasts them out of existence. This is bad news. The letter to the soldiers of Coroticus is not what you want people to be reading, so they simply left it out. Okay? But they gave away the story. The Book of Armagh is one of those things, some of you may remember, depending on how old you are, there used to be a picture in circulation years ago of the Soviet Politburo. You know these May-Day march pasts where you would have Stalin and the rest of the Politburo waving to the serried ranks of Soviet military. And somebody pointed out that there was one set of legs too many in the photograph. If you went along, you realized there was just one set of legs too many with no body to match it, as it were. And of course the body had been airbrushed out of existence because it was one of those Soviets who had fallen into disfavor with Stalin and was therefore airbrushed, literally airbrushed out of history. So something like that happens in the Book of Armagh, because at the very beginning, I didn't show it to you there now in the slides I had, at the very beginning of the patrician section in the Book of Armagh, the heading is Incipiunt Libri Sancti Patrici Episcopi. Here begin the books of the Holy Bishop Patrick. Okay? But incipiunt is a plural verb. It's not incipit, if there were one. It's incipiunt. There are more than one. But of course, there's only the confession that follows. So you say, why is the verb in the plural if the only text that follows the heading is the singular? And the reason was that, of course, the authors, the scribes of the Book of Armagh did have the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus, but they decided to leave it out. But they left their trail behind them. They didn't cover over their tracks sufficiently for us not to notice nowadays. That's the kind of thing that Thompson is good at. He's very meticulous, very forensic, very detailed, very precise, and it is, as I say, probably the best book, I would say, on the subject. An alternative is this one. Some of you may know or may have heard of Liam Dupuer, a very, very fine scholar. He was in UCD in my time. Taught me when I was an undergraduate. He used to have an article in the Irish Times every week called Roots, which is super. Anything by Liam Dupuer is worth reading. He was really, really good. His wife too, Maureen McDermott, was a fine scholar and archaeologist. Liam Dupuer was very, very good for all kinds of reasons. He wrote an article in 1968 which set a new standard in the analysis of the whole patrician stuff and proved, I think, to everybody's satisfaction, more or less, that what we have of St. Patrick, the legend as we have of St. Patrick, was actually concocted by the Church of Armagh in the 7th century. It is a bag of lies. Pretty much everything in it, from start to finish, is doctored, tampered with, bits deleted, bits added, whatever it was that the Church of Armagh felt it was necessary to do to present a particular picture of St. Patrick, namely the Patrick who supposedly founded Armagh. There's no evidence whatsoever that Patrick founded Armagh. He certainly doesn't say so in his writings, and there's no evidence that he did. But there is, as a big lie, it's superbly successful. It's sort of like Trump saying, well, the Americans have given $350 billion to Ukraine, okay? We know that's complete poppycock, you know, but if you say it often enough, people will believe it. It's like weapons of mass destruction. Repeat after me, weapons of mass destruction. And all of a sudden, everybody believes in weapons of mass destruction, okay? So the Armagh case, for its connection, for its origins, if you like, lying in the person of St. Patrick, is a complete fabrication from start to finish. Except for the fact that the Book of Armagh does have Patrick's writings. If you ask me, how can I explain? How do I explain Patrick's writings? And the two of them were there, definitely, even though they only copied the one. How do I explain that Patrick's writings were in Armagh around 800? I can't. I don't know why. They obviously believed it had something to do with their original history, but the basis for that belief is something else. Okay, I better let you go before we all fall asleep. This is the most recent book on the subject. Now, again, I emphasize the fact that what I'm showing you is just a selection. Remember, the Royal Irish Academy abandoned the idea of doing all the Patrick stuff because it's just too much. So you're only getting a selection as it occurs to me, so to speak. This is the most recent book by a UCD historian, Roy Fleschner, whom you might have heard of. It depends. I think he gained a certain notoriety back in 2011 when he published an article in a newspaper suggesting that Patrick had actually come to Ireland as a tax dodger. That's really, it made the front page of the New York Times. It was big news at the time. Lots of people were talking about it. This appeared in 2019. It's obviously a more elaborate thing. I think it's fair to say that it's controversial. Roy has views on St. Patrick that not other historians would subscribe to or believe, but it does show that the story of St. Patrick is still alive and well, and that's the reason why I put it here, why I finished with it. Do I recommend it? If you see it, buy it, okay? If you see it second-hand, buy it, okay? And read it, and then decide for yourselves what it's like, okay? But I leave things that way, okay? And thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Fascinating. While we're giving you a chance to draw your breath before any questions, can I say that the Donaghpatrick Kilcoona Heritage Society runs on fresh air? The only problem is that fresh air runs out very easily, so that's why we have the bucket over here, and if anyone wants to get rid of loose change or anything like that, they can, there's a little hole in the top. Also, Clare has lovely stuff there that can be bought quite reasonably if you're interested. It's mostly historical stuff based around Knockmeh and that sort of stuff. Thank yous to yourselves for coming up tonight. Special thank you to my baby Murren, who set up the whole place here for you and is getting a cup of tea ready for you as I speak. Claire for all her work on the computer and all the advertising and all the other stuff. So if there are any questions, I'm sure Dáibhí would be delighted. I'm kind of, my bubble is burst at this stage.
Start here. Yeah.
The document in Italy
The document?
that you found in Italy?
Oh, yeah, that had nothing to do with Patrick, but I'll tell you about it anyway. If you ask, when did Patrick come to Ireland, the date we gave was 432, and if you ask, how do you know that? Because it's in the Irish Annals. And there's a set of documents that we call the Irish Annals, which are extremely important for the reconstruction of everything to do with Irish history. And an annal is a record of events that happen every year, from annus, the Latin word annus. So it's like an annual, if you think of, the comic books and the annuals that appeared every year. An annus, or an annal, is a record of events, a contemporary record of events as they happen. And we have in the Irish Annals probably the single most important historical source of information for Irish history, without exception. And we have far more in that regard than anybody either in the offshore island or in continental Europe. We have a huge amount of information, a lot of it based on the annals. The trouble with the annals is, or was, that in the early period, probably in Patrick's period, there were different Easter tables in circulation. An annal is a notification of something that happens, like somebody dies, or or something like that. And somebody writes it down. Where do they write it down? They usually wrote it down in the margin of these Easter tables. An Easter table is like, I was never good at it, log tables. Think of school log tables, okay? With lots of margins, lots of blank spaces on them. And wherever something occurred beside a given year in an Easter table, somebody wrote down the event that they recorded, okay? But the Easter tables in that period, there was more than one. In fact, there were 2 or 3 or more in circulation at the same time. And eventually, the Irish opted for what everybody else was using and discarded whatever they had been using previously. The trouble was they discarded everything they'd been using previously so effectively that no record of it survived. There was no copy of the original Irish Easter table until yours truly found it in Padua. I found it accidentally in Padua in 1984-5. Yeah. The only known copy of the table to survive. And on the basis of it, it was possible to reconstruct the chronology of early Irish history and to re-establish all the dates that had previously been either uncertain or missing or whatever the case may be. So that's what the Padua manuscript is about. Well, you'd have to steal it first, The monks in Padua have it in their library. They'll hang on to it, I'd say. Yeah. You had a question, yeah?
That was absolutely fascinating. So we have Patrick, we have Claudius.
Yeah.
But you mentioned a third Patrick, so who is he and what?
Some people believe in a third Patrick. I don't. There is an occasional reference to a Shan Fodric, old Patrick, whatever that means. I don't really believe it. There's no evidence really to back it up. Patrick is there, Patricius, Palladius. I don't think there is a third one really. It was believed. You saw Sherman in his Loca Patriciana had reference to 3 Patricks, and for a while it was an idea that was doing the rounds, but I don't think anybody would champion it anymore.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Jessica, yeah?
Thank you, Doug. That was really, really interesting. I was wondering about the idea that Patrick is a kind of an epithet or a nickname rather than a personal name, and that it just means the posh guy.
It can do, and it did in older Roman society, as you know. Yeah, Patricius was a title.
Yes.
Yeah, it was. But the reason why we think it's his name is he has the ego Patricius, and it seems to be a reference to him by name.
Right.
But yes, I take your point, and the point has been made before, yeah. And that, in a way, was one of the reasons why people could argue that maybe Patrick was the same as Palladius.
Okay.
That Patricius is just a title, but that his real name was Palladius, or vice versa.
Sure.
There is actually a note in the Book of Armagh which talks about Palladius, qui et alio nomine Patricius. Patrick, who was also known by another name, Patricius. And that's the simplest solution to your problem. If you're presented with 2 people who appear to be different, but who appear to share a certain number of historical features,
Yes.
then you can argue that there's been a confusion, and that really they are ultimately the one. But it doesn't really work for Palladius, because Palladius is too well documented. And the really important thing about Palladius is that he's mentioned by Prosper.
Yeah.
And Prosper is a continental writer, and therefore the guys in Armagh didn't have access to him. They couldn't fiddle him, they couldn't tamper with him, they couldn't airbrush the evidence. They were stuck on. And in fact, the later annalists who discover Prosper, probably already by the 7th century, are faced with this conundrum. Who is this Palladius fella? who appears to have arrived sent in 431, maybe he arrived in 432, it's hard to know. The 432 date, by the way, for Patrick is almost certainly because Palladius disappears from the record almost immediately. He has a sort of walk-on part in Irish history. There he is in 429. He's the man who's the person who instigates the mission to Britain. He's the person at whose suggestion Pope Celestine sends Germanus to Britain, and Britain is restored to the Catholic faith and they all live happily ever after. And by virtue of the fact that he obviously did this good work in 429, he's promoted in 431, made bishop by the same Celestine, and sent to Ireland. And you might say, Ireland, what did the poor man do to be sent to Ireland? It's like sending the parish priest out to Achill, you know, after he's done something wrong. Why was Palladius sent to Ireland? Well, that's a different story altogether. But after that, there is no more Palladius in continental sources. Nobody ever mentions him again. So the question does arise, why? Did he exist, in fact, or what's going on here? And that obviously was a question that occurred to the Irish historians from the 7th century. And they say, well, what happened to this guy, Palladius? And they say, well, of course, he's our Patrick. He just becomes Patrick in the Irish sources, and they put the two together. But it's a nice idea, but it doesn't work, unfortunately. There's too much in the Palladian tradition that doesn't work in the Patrick story, and vice versa. That idea won't work. Moja? Yeah?
But that's the idea. That's where they get the idea that Patrick went to the continent.
Exactly, yeah. They have the two traditions put together. So you have Patrick on the continent for anywhere up to 40 years. He studies with Germanus, he's in Auxerre, he gets the best education you could possibly have in the period, and yet in his writings he say, I'm rustiциssimus. I'm the rudest, crudest dog you ever met. And I can hardly put a sentence together. You say, hang on a minute, now look, you've just studied for 40 years with Germanus and the rest of these guys, what are you talking about, okay? So clearly it doesn't work. The whole background of Patrick on the continent doesn't work. And in fact, Patrick in his own letter says, I would love to go to the continent to meet the fellow Christians. But he doesn't. It's quite clear he didn't. He never made it. He'd like to have gone, but he didn't.
Why do so many reputable historians produce such poor accounts?
It's a good
There's a question of the facts getting in the way of a good story.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, Thompson has a wonderful expression there, particularly apropos of everything that was published around about 1961, 1962, because 461 Patrick supposedly died, or died the second time, or whatever the case may be. And there's all these kinds of articles in journals like Studies, the Jesuit Journal Studies, and all this kind of thing. And most of it is dismissed by Thompson as maudlin flapdoodle. And this is just pious gush. This is just rubbish. And you do ask yourself, how could, I mean, John Ryan, for example, who was the editor of that volume there that appeared in 1954 that had Esposito in it, he had very strong views about St. Patrick, and he was professor of early Irish history in UCD. He was MacNeil's successor. So you would imagine he ought to know what he did, but what he writes about Patrick is just pious mush. It's just impossible. I don't know. There's something about Patrick that brings out this silliness in historians. Really, I mean, part of the problem is that the story is written by people who are not trained historians. You know, someone like Beeler, who's a great scholar, you know, fantastic Latinist and a great classicist and so on. But if you're not trained in the proper use of historical sources, then who knows what you're going to come up with, you know. Yeah, but it's a good question. Yeah, there is an awful lot of rubbish. Yeah.
I'm disappointed you wasn't from France. There's a lot of French people called Patrick.
Patrice, yeah, and Patrick, yeah, I know, yeah. Yes, please.
Can you try to elaborate why came across March the 17th as...
March 17, yes, okay, yeah. March 17 is in the Book of Armagh, but the Book of Armagh is 800, or somewhere between 800 and 850, let's say. But there is a wonderful source on the continent, and again, that's the reason why we think it's probably okay. It's like Prosper, you know, on the continent. He can't be tampered with by the Irish because they have no access to him. But there is a life of a woman called Gertrude. Have you ever heard of Gertrude of Nivelles in Belgium? Gertrude was a 7th century saint She was one of the ancestor figures, so to speak, or the ancestors of the later Caherlistrane family. If you think of Charlemagne and all those people, Gertrude was related to all those people. And she was not a foundress, but she inherited a nunnery, as it were, from her mother, Nivelle. And there is a life written about her. She died in 657. There's a life vita written by a member of the community in Nivelle, very close to that date. It's one of the best early lives of saints that we have from the continent. And the story is that while she was on her deathbed, there was an Irishman beside her. And she said, "Hang in there, Gertie, old girl. And if you manage 2 more days, you will meet up with St. Patrick on the 17th of March. I think it's 1 day, actually. She's only to hang in 1 day. And on the next day, she snuffs it, and up she goes, and she's greeted by the great man in heaven. Now you say, how could a writer in Belgium in the mid-7th century know that the 17th of March is Patrick's Day, other than by, it is. It probably was. The Irish who had gone to the continent by then, they are the same people, by the way, almost certainly the same people, who brought the original confession of St. Patrick. Remember I told you that the Book of Armagh had a tampered version? And we know that because we can compare it with later continental copies. But the later continental copies were based on one of these versions that came out of Ireland in the mid-7th century, which was uncontaminated, unfiddled with. And almost certainly there was a cult, what we would call a cult of St. Patrick, already by the mid-7th century. People were already in mind. In fact, there's a text that my wife Maura here edited way back 40 or 50 years ago, a famous letter to do with the Easter controversy. It has to do with this Easter table that we were talking about a moment ago. It's up there. I know Kenny said that the Book of Armagh is the most important document in the early Irish Church. We would say, well, what about Cummian's letter? There is a famous letter on the whole question of the Easter controversy in the early Irish Church, authored by a man called Cummian, sent by him to the abbot of Iona, Sheikh Éada. It's a fascinating document. It goes through all the details of how do you calculate the date of Easter, and what do you use and what can you not use, and what does Rome recommend, and blah, blah, blah. In fact, he talks about there was such a degree of controversy amongst the Irish at the time that they actually sent a delegation to Rome. It's very interesting as an insight into how the Irish Church tackled a problem like the Easter controversy. What do you do when you cannot agree on something? So they sent out a delegation to Rome to see how they do it in Rome. And he says they came back and they saw various things and so on. It's very, very interesting. But that letter was written in 632, 633. Earlier than that life of Gertrude that I mentioned a moment ago, roughly 25 years or so. And he says that amongst the various authorities I have, from my point of view, I have this list of 10 different texts on the subject of Easter. And he says the first one is the one that the Holy Patrick, our Papa, brought and used. Primum illum quem sanctus patricius. It's an interesting use. It's the earliest usage of the word sanctus with Patrick. So you could translate it either as the Holy Patrick or Saint Patrick. It's the same thing, obviously. Primum illum, first of all. Now he said, first of all, even before St. Augustine, St. Jerome, all the great fathers of the church, big noises in the early history of the church. He said, no, primum illum, the first one in our list, is that which Sanctus Patricius, Papa Noster, our Father. It's the only place in all of Latin literature in Ireland, in all of Hiberno-Latin literature as we call it, it's the only place where anybody is called Papa Noster, and that person is Patrick. Even though Cummian, we can decide, we're not altogether sure, but he almost certainly was writing from the south of Ireland or the South Midlands. He had nothing to do with Armagh. He's not part of the Armagh propaganda machine that's cranking out all this kind of stuff. He has Papa Noster Sanctus Patricius. So there clearly was a cult, and in this case you could almost say an all-Ireland cult of St. Patrick by the 630s. And therefore you could explain why it is in the 650s that somebody can say out in Nivelle, hang in there, Gertie, and tomorrow, if you're gone, he'll be up there to greet you.
Time for a couple.